Hello, welcome to EarnQA. So in this session, we are going to talk about the object and object types in UFT. So basically, we must know before we start using the QTP's object repository, before we start using the actual scripting part in UFT, we must know what is an object and how many object types we have and how do we manipulate them, how do we understand them with respect to the application. So there are so many questions that we must know, and then only it becomes very easy for us to understand and then automate the application objects or application scenarios. So today, let's get started and learn step by step all about the object and object type. Let's get started. So this is the agenda in our session today. So we would briefly talk about what is an object and what is the object repository and what is the meaning of object to type. How many object types we have in the QTP? How do we identify the objects and how do we get the different properties? And then what is the relationship between application and the QTP? And how does these objects are being carried to the object repository? What is inside the object repository? What can we do with the object repository? And then we talk about the different properties, the different methods of the objects. So that is the agenda. So let's get started and learn all the things about object and object properties. So let's define what is an object. So object is the one which exists. Anything which exists is an object, either in the real or in the imaginary. Anything whatsoever which exists in the reality or in the imaginary is known to be an object. And every object is to be identified because objects have characteristics, and those characteristics are known to be properties. So objects have properties. By means of that, objects can be identified. Let's have a look at this slide. So anything which exists is an object, and that can be either in the reality or in the imaginary. I am an object, you're an object, laptop is an object, mobile is an object, mouse is an object, speaker is an object, table is an object. Everything which exists either in reality or in imaginary is an object. And all the objects have properties associated to that object. The properties can be name, size, type, usage, purpose, appearance, layout. There are so many characteristics or properties that the object have. So because of these objects which are having the properties, it becomes easy for us to identify these objects. So let me define again. Object is the one which exists. Anything which exists is an object that can be in the reality or imaginary. Basically, objects have properties such as name, length, size, width, type, usage, purpose, appearance, so many other things. Let's take a small example. How do we identify a mobile? Why don't we say a mobile to be a laptop? We would never say a mobile as a laptop. Rather, we would always say a mobile as a mobile. Why? Because mobile has a certain predefined characteristics to that. It has a size. It has a type. It has its own usage. It has its own purpose. It has its own appearance. And because of all these characteristics, we always name that as a mobile. We always call that as a mobile. Why do we say a laptop as a laptop? Why don't we say a laptop as a monitor or a desktop? Because the properties that the desktop have is different. The properties that the laptop has is different. So that is the reason we call a laptop as a laptop. We call a desktop as a desktop. So just simple thing, remember, object is the one which exists. Anything whatsoever which exists either in the reality or in the imaginary is known to be an object. And objects have properties, and because of these properties we are properly able to identify the objects: laptop, mobile, pen, pencil, table, bag, mouse, keyboard, screen, speaker, table. So these are all the objects. You are an object. I am an object because I have my own properties: name, height, width, color, maybe designation, maybe the way that I behave, my attitude. So everyone has its own characteristics, properties, and that's the reason every object is needs to be or identified to be unique. Similarly, when it comes to QTP, QTP has certain thing which can read these properties. And if we can keenly observe ourselves, because all the properties of devices or things or objects are pre-stored in our brain. And because of that, the moment when we look at object, we call that by name: a table, a screen, a monitor, a TV, a mouse, a pen. Similarly, QTP has certain thing already with it. That is so called object repository. Object repository is a place where QTP learns the objects, captures them, and stores those objects information in the object repository in the point of logical names and physical descriptions. Nothing to worry what is a logical name and physical description, because we are going to talk about that in a while from now. But the important factor, just like the way that we have our brain to capture and identify an object, QTP has a brain called object repository, and by means of that it captures the objects. It identifies, captures, and stores the objects and objects information in the point of their properties, logical names and physical descriptions. And if you could look at this slide, so that is the object repository of the QTP. This is the object repository of the QTP, where it identifies it's a browser, it's a page, within the page it's a link, it's an image, it's a button. It identifies everything. Not only that, against each and every object, it has the properties. A class type of browser, it has a unique name. So it is going to capture and store all the properties of each and every object. And because of that, it is able to recognize, it is able to identify, and it is able to play back the script successfully on the application. Example, what is this? This is a web edit. And similarly, QTP identifies this web edit is a class of web edit. It's a type of input. It's a name containing username. Correct. And because of these properties, which are unique to identify that particular object, QTP would always identify that object uniquely and properly. Example, this is an image. True. What kind of properties it has? It's a class type. Class nothing but a category. It's an image category. What is the type? It's an image type. What is the name? It's a Google. The name of the image is Google. And because of these properties, QTP is able to understand that properly. Again, this is a button. Correct. What is the property? It has properties called class, button, web button, type, submit, name, sign in. And because of that, QTP able to identify that uniquely. So for in this particular slide, the main intention is two things. What is object and how do we identify the object? Similar to that, QTP identifies the object. So object is the one which exists, and every object has properties. And we know or we identify the properties, and that helps to call the name of the object. That helps to identify the object. Similarly, QTP has its own brain called object repository. By means of that, it identifies the application objects and stores that information, objects information, what is the name, what is the class, what is the type, and the other properties, whatever is necessary, it stores that. And because of that, it is able to identify the application object successfully. So that is the agenda. Now we know what is an object and how does QTP treat or know to identify the object. QTP knows to identify the object because it has a brain called object repository. Let's go and see now the next one, how many object types we have. Basically, there are two types. One is the test object. The second one is the runtime object. So what is the test object? Test object is the one which is identified, captured and stored by the QTP into its object repository by means of their logical names and physical descriptions. Nothing but their properties. Whatever where the QTP recognizes, whatever where the QTP identifies the object and stored into QTP object repository, and that object is known to be test object. And test objects are identified during the recording time, or we could also identify and add them to the object repository. Either way, whatever is stored in the object repository, and those objects are known to be test object. The second category, runtime object. What is a runtime object? Let me give you an example so that you would understand the exact difference between test object and runtime object. If you look at me or if you know me, you know only few things about me. You know my name, you know my nature, you know my attitude. But you do not know if I am angry, how do I react? You do not know if I am sad, how do I react? So it means that all the properties that you know are again the same, but at certain time they might change. You might feel that I am very friendly. You might feel that I am very good. You might feel that I am very close to you. But however, at certain times that might change because of the mood. If I am angry, that might change. If I am sad, that might change. If I am not at all able to talk anything, that might give you different impression. So it means that the same object at certain times behaves differently because of the runtime nature, the runtime characteristics. So now how do we define a runtime object? Runtime object, nothing but which resembles the test object. But however, it might change or it might not change its properties during the runtime. Example, if I am there, if you know something about me, if I match the same thing that you know about me, I am still a test object. But certain times, if I am not able to match, seems like there is a change and that becomes a runtime change. So runtime change is a alter in the property or change in the property because of certain dynamic nature that might impact the object repository properties. Let me define properly. Runtime objects are those which resemble the test objects. However, they might or they might not change the properties during runtime. Let me give you an example to this. Let me give you an example. What is a test object and how can a runtime object come into picture? If it is a runtime object, what is the difference? How can a runtime object change their properties? So with a practical example, you would understand. And now after this slide, I'm going to demo you what exactly is the difference between test object and runtime object. And again, all the objects have properties: name, type, class, category, length, width, size, certain properties. And by means of these properties, QTP is able to identify. Similar to that, all the objects can be manipulated with the methods, with activities. Example, my methods: I can speak, I can listen, I can eat, I can walk, I can talk, I can explain, I can show something else. So these are all called to be methods. Methods nothing but activities. I sleep, I wake up, I run, I jog, I eat, I talk, I explain activities. Similar to that, we could also manipulate the objects by means of the methods. We can click on a method. We can click on a object. Click is a method. We can select a list item from the list box. Select is a method. I can close the browser. Close is a method. I can open. I can select something. I can click on a link. I can enter a value. I can enter a password. So these are all methods that we use to manipulate the objects. So that's all about objects are two types. Test object, runtime object. Test objects are those which are identified, captured and stored by the QTP into its object repository. And QTP learns, captures, identifies and stores the objects with their properties. And object properties in two segments, logical names and physical descriptions. When we talk about object repository, I would explain you in detail in a practical session what is a logical name and what are the physical descriptions. But at this point of time, it stores the objects with their properties. And test objects by default are captured either by recording or we can manually add them during the coding time. Runtime objects are those which resemble, which are nothing but, which are similar or which are almost the same of test objects. But however, they might change, they might not change the properties. If they change, then there is a problem with the QTP to identify. If they don't change, then there is no problem. QTP properly identifies and we could easily run the script successfully. If there is a change, then how do we tackle that situation? That we would learn about in the coming sessions. Very good. Let me just go and explain a little more. If you look at this slide, already we discussed objects which are identified, stored in the QTP's object repository with their objects names are known to be test object. And all the test objects would have certain test object properties. Test object properties something but name, class, type, size, width, x coordinate, y coordinate, so many other things. And these things can be captured. And while QTP captures test object, it uses 5 different mechanisms known to be object identification methods. There are 5 object identification methods: mandatory properties, assistive properties, index properties, coordinate based properties and smart identification. So nothing to worry at this point of time because the next presentation is all about object identification methods. But at this point of time, our aim is to know what is an object, what are the object types we have, what is the test object, what is the runtime object, how do we differentiate. In the next session, we would talk about the object identification mechanism or the object identification methodologies like mandatory properties, assistive properties, index properties, coordinate based properties and smart identification. And similar to that, runtime objects are those which are similar to the test objects, but they may or may not change their properties. Let me give you a practical session so that you would exactly understand what is the difference between a test object and runtime object. Let me open the UFT and let me also open a browser and you could see that. So there is a browser and there is one link called orange. If I click that link, there is a link red. If I click that link, the link becomes green. If I click that, orange, blue, brown, orange. So it keeps on changing the object name. Nothing but it keeps on changing one of the object property called name. Same link, but it keeps on changing the object property called name. Now, how does the QTP know this object? How does the QTP identify this object? And any problem in identifying? Or while we play back the script, is it doing properly? Is there any issue in doing that? Let's go and learn this so that we would differentiate between the test object and runtime object. Good. So now I would stop this session and I would conduct again the next session with the practical examples to solve about the test object and runtime object. So thank you so much for watching the video. Hope you liked it. In the next session, we would go and detail explain about the practical implementation towards the objects, object categories, test object and runtime object. We have just looked at a slide. We just looked at a browser where it has a link which keeps on changing the property called name. Then how do we manipulate that? How do we work with that dynamic link? What is the difference between test object and runtime object? That is the next agenda that we're going to look into. So thank you so much for watching the video. Hope you liked it. Please visit earnqa.com. There are so many videos, presentations, articles, books, PDFs with regards to automation, test management, performance testing, and functional testing. Thank you so much. See you again.